You board a plane in London and step off in New York less than 3 hours later. That's not a hypothetical. That's a Tuesday on the Concorde. So today we're counting down 15 facts about one of the most extraordinary passenger aircraft ever built. Starting with number 15, that droop nose. 15. The nose that changed shape mid-flight. Every other commercial jet looks more or less the same on approach as it does at cruise. The Concorde did not. On takeoff and landing, the entire forward section of the nose tilted downward by 12.5 degrees, about the angle of a steep residential driveway, but on the front of a supersonic aircraft. The reason was the delta wing. That enormous triangular planform gave the Concorde its supersonic performance, but it came with a cost. To generate enough lift at low speeds, the aircraft had to pitch its nose up at a steep angle on approach. Steep enough that without intervention, the pilots would have been staring at the sky instead of the runway. So, the nose drooped. Hydraulically, on command, giving the flight crew a clear sightline to the ground below. There were actually two positions, 4.5 degrees for takeoff, 12.5 for landing, with a retractable visor that sat ahead of the windscreen and folded down with it. At cruise, both the visor and the nose retracted flush with the fuselage. Smooth, sealed, aerodynamically clean. The aircraft wore two completely different faces depending on what it was doing. No other commercial aircraft in history has used a mechanism like it. The engineering to make it work, the hydraulic actuators, the sealing systems, the visor mechanism that had to withstand Mach 2 airflow and then fold away neatly for landing, added weight and complexity that a conventional jet simply doesn't carry. The Concorde carried it anyway, because without it, the aircraft couldn't land safely at a speed slow enough for a runway. What you saw from the terminal, watching a Concorde come in, was a machine that looked like it was hunting. The nose angled down, the delta wing huge and flat behind it, the whole aircraft descending at an angle steeper than anything else in the sky. Pilots described the approach as unlike any other aircraft they had ever flown. High angle of attack, high power settings, the 4 Olympus engines still pushing hard all the way to the threshold. And then the nose came back up, the visor sealed, and on the ground it looked like any other aircraft. Almost. The droop nose became the most recognizable feature of the most recognizable aircraft in commercial aviation. The one detail that made it unmistakable from 2 miles away, on approach, in silhouette. The only commercial jet that changed shape depending on what it was doing, and nothing since has needed to. Number 14, thermal expansion, and one very unfortunate hat. At Mach 2, 1,350 miles per hour, roughly twice the speed of sound. Aerodynamic friction heats the outside of an aircraft the way a hand heats a piece of metal held against a grinding wheel. Sustained. Inescapable. The Concorde's aluminium skin reached over 100 degrees Celsius at the nose during a typical transatlantic crossing. That's hotter than boiling water. And aluminium, like all metals, expands when it gets hot. The Concorde stretched. Not metaphorically, physically. From nose to tail, the airframe grew by between 6 and 10 inches during cruise. Almost a foot. The aircraft that pushed back from the gate at Heathrow was measurably shorter than the one that leveled off at 60,000 feet over the Atlantic. Engineers designing the interior had to account for this. Gaps appeared in the trim panels where components that sat flush on the ground separated slightly at altitude. The floor expanded, the ceiling expanded. The entire tube of the aircraft was a slightly different size in the air than it was on the ground. This created a problem for one flight engineer, and it's the kind of problem that could only happen on this particular aircraft. During cruise, he placed his uniform cap on a ledge near the cockpit, a gap between a panel and the bulkhead just wide enough to slot it in. Standard enough behavior. Except that at Mach 2, that gap was wider than it was at rest because the fuselage had expanded around it. When the Concorde decelerated, cooled, and contracted back to its ground dimensions, the aluminium closed around the cap, permanently. The hat was sealed inside the structure of the aircraft, pinched between the panel and the bulkhead, and there it stayed. No comment needed on that one. The engineers who designed the Concorde knew thermal expansion was coming. The aircraft was built from a specific aluminium alloy, RR58, developed for the program, chosen partly because it retained its strength at elevated temperatures better than standard aviation aluminium. The entire airframe was painted white specifically to reflect solar radiation and reduce skin temperatures by a meaningful margin. A darker paint scheme would have pushed temperatures higher still, potentially beyond what the alloy could safely handle at sustained cruise. So the white livery wasn't a branding decision, it was a thermal management system. What this meant in practice was that the Concorde was always in a conversation with its own temperature, expanding on the way up, contracting on the way down, the structure breathing with every flight cycle in a way that no subsonic jet experiences. After 27 years of service, the airframes had logged thousands of these cycles, each one a full expansion and contraction, each one the aircraft becoming briefly a foot longer than it was designed to be on the ground. The hat, presumably, is still there. 13. The view from the edge of space, 60,000 feet. That's 11 miles straight up, about twice the cruising altitude of a standard long-haul jet, and high enough that the atmosphere above you starts to look less like sky and more like the thin membrane it actually is. That's where the Concorde flew, every flight, routinely. At that altitude, the sky above the aircraft shaded from pale blue at the horizon to a deep, darkening indigo directly overhead. Not quite black, but close enough that passengers pressed against those small oval windows and described seeing stars in the middle of the afternoon. The curvature of the Earth was visible, not suggested, not implied by the slight arc of a distant coastline, actually visible. The horizon bending away in both directions, the planet revealing its shape to anyone with a window seat and a clear day. The windows themselves were part of the experience. Small, roughly the size of a sheet of A4 paper set deep into the fuselage wall. They were double-paned and, at cruise, warm to the touch. Outside, the air temperature was around minus 57 degrees Celsius, but the skin friction heating that stretched the fuselage also kept the exterior of the aircraft hot, and some of that heat conducted inward. You could press a hand to the window and feel the Mach 2 atmosphere on the other side of a few centimeters of glass. No other commercial passenger aircraft cruised at this altitude as a matter of standard operation. The Concorde's flight profile demanded it. Thinner air at 60,000 feet meant less aerodynamic drag, which was essential for sustaining Mach 2 cruise without burning through fuel reserves even faster than the aircraft already did. The high altitude was a consequence of the physics, not a selling point, but it became one anyway. British Airways and Air France both used the view in their marketing, and passengers consistently cited it as one of the defining features of the experience. A small number of very frequent flyers, the kind who crossed the Atlantic weekly on business, reported that the view never became routine. 11 miles up, moving at 1,350 miles per hour, the Earth below reduced to a slow-scrolling map of ocean and cloud. The Concorde flew above most weather systems entirely. Turbulence at 60,000 feet is rare. The ride was, by most accounts, exceptionally smooth, which added a particular quality of unreality to the whole thing. You were high enough to see the shape of the planet, and you were moving fast enough to outrun the sunset, and you were sitting in a commercial aircraft that you had boarded at Heathrow 2 hours earlier with nothing more than a ticket and a passport. A private viewing gallery on the edge of space, available only to those who could afford the fastest ticket in the world. The sky that most people never see, timetabled, twice daily. At number 12, the Concorde flew faster than the sun. The sun moves westward across the sky at roughly 900 miles per hour relative to the ground at mid-latitudes. That's not a metaphor for how fast sunsets happen. It's the actual angular velocity of the Earth's rotation translated into surface speed. 900 miles per hour, westward, continuously. The Concorde cruised at 1,350 miles per hour. So, on westbound transatlantic flights, London to New York or Paris to New York, the Concorde was outrunning the sun. Passengers who boarded at Heathrow in the late morning, flying west into a sky that was already bright, would watch through those small oval windows as the sun appeared to reverse direction. Instead of tracking across the sky from east to west as it does for everyone standing still on the ground, It rose in the west. Climbed. The aircraft was moving faster than the planet was rotating beneath it, and the sun gave away the fact. Departure from London, around 10:30 in the morning. Arrival in New York, around 9 in the morning, local time, the same morning. You landed before you took off, by the clock. Not a time zone trick, not just the usual disorientation of crossing 5 time zones westbound. The Concorde was genuinely traveling backward through the calendar day fast enough that passengers who left London after breakfast arrived in New York before breakfast. Some regular flyers on the route, the weekly commuters, the investment bankers and film executives who treated it like a bus, would eat breakfast in New York, take the afternoon Concorde back to London, land in time for dinner, and have logged fewer hours in the air than a standard transatlantic passenger sitting in a 747 flying the other direction. British Airways leaned into this. Their advertising copy for the westbound service made the time reversal explicit. Leave London at 10:30, arrive New York at 9. The arithmetic was the selling point. What made it physically possible was the combination of speed and the geometry of the Earth's rotation. The effect only works going west. Eastbound, the Concorde was moving with the Earth's rotation, not against it. And the crossing took roughly 3.5 hours instead of 3.25, because the headwinds that assist westbound flights become the tailwinds that assist eastbound ones. The jet stream runs west to east across the North Atlantic, and the Concorde used it in both directions differently. The westbound crossing, though, London to New York, was the one that broke something in the brain. You watched the sun rise in the wrong direction, landed in the past, and walked out into a New York morning that hadn't happened yet when you left. There is something profoundly, almost philosophically disorienting about flying into the past, and the Concorde did it on a published timetable, 6 days a week for 27 years. 11. The ticket price, and who was actually buying. In the early 1990s, a return ticket on Concorde between London and New York cost around £8,000. In today's money, that's somewhere north of £12,000. Roughly the price of a decent secondhand car spent on a single round trip that lasted under 6 hours of flying time combined. The cabin held 100 passengers. That's it. It's 100 seats, arranged 2 by 2 either side of a single narrow aisle, in a tube that was about as wide as a generous hallway, almost comically narrow compared to the wide-body jets that were carrying 400 people across the same ocean for a fraction of the price. So who was in those 100 seats? Some of them were exactly who you'd expect. Executives, financiers, anyone whose time was worth more per hour than the ticket cost to buy. Banks and the law firms routinely booked their senior partners on Concorde for transatlantic meetings, on the straightforward calculation that 3 hours of travel instead of 7 represented 4 hours of billable time recovered. The economics were, in that specific context, almost rational. But then there were the regulars, passengers who flew so frequently that they knew the cabin crew by name, and the cabin crew knew their drink orders before they sat down. British Airways operated a dedicated Concorde lounge at Heathrow, the Concorde Room, and for a certain tier of frequent flyer, it functioned less like an airport facility and more like a private members club that happened to have a supersonic aircraft attached to it. And then there was Phil Collins. In July 1985, Collins performed at Live Aid at Wembley Stadium in London. Then he boarded a Concorde, crossed the Atlantic, and performed again at the Live Aid concert in Philadelphia the same afternoon. Same calendar day. 2 continents. 1 musician. The only reason it was physically possible was that the Concorde existed and that Collins could afford to be on it. That story gets cited constantly, and for good reason. It compresses everything remarkable about the aircraft into a single human-scale fact. Not a speed record, not an engineering specification, just a man who played 2 concerts on 2 continents in 1 afternoon because the plane was fast enough. The cabin itself reinforced the exclusivity in every dimension. Low ceiling, tall passengers ducked to board, narrow seats by modern business class standards, windows smaller than a hardback book. The Concorde offered no lie-flat beds, no privacy screens, no suite-style enclosures. What it offered was speed, altitude, and the knowledge that there were 99 other people in the world on this particular flight, and roughly everyone else was 7 hours behind you. They were paying for time, 3 hours instead of 7, and everything that implied about who you were and what your time was worth. The arithmetic was the status symbol. The afterburners. Number 10. Igniting an afterburner means injecting raw fuel directly into the exhaust stream behind a jet engine and lighting it. The result is a second combustion event happening outside the engine itself, a controlled explosion in the tailpipe that produces a visible column of flame and a thrust increase of roughly 30 to 50% per engine. Military jets use afterburners to accelerate through the sound barrier in seconds. The Concorde used them to take off. All four. Every single departure, without exception. The four Rolls-Royce and Snecma Olympus 593 engines, each one producing around 38,000 pounds of thrust at full afterburner, were the most powerful engines ever fitted to a commercial passenger aircraft. At takeoff, with all four afterburners lit, the combined thrust was roughly equivalent to the output of 160 Formula One cars firing simultaneously. The aircraft needed every bit of it. The Concorde was heavy, it was aerodynamically demanding at low speeds, and it had to accelerate through the sound barrier with a full load of passengers and enough fuel to cross the Atlantic. The sound this produced was not subtle. Residents living near Heathrow, Charles de Gaulle, and JFK described the Concorde's departure as something felt as much as heard, a low-frequency roar that arrived before the aircraft was visible and lingered after it had gone. Noise complaints were filed consistently across all three airports for the entire 27 years of commercial service. Heathrow imposed strict noise monitoring procedures specifically for Concorde operations. JFK had departure corridors and thrust cutback procedures designed to minimize the impact on surrounding communities, which the Concorde followed while still being, by a significant margin, the loudest commercial departure in the airport's history. The afterburners were cut at around 1,000 feet once the aircraft had enough speed and altitude to sustain the climb on dry thrust alone. That cutback was audible from the ground, a distinct reduction in the roar that residents near the departure path learned to recognize as the signal that the worst of it was over. But here's the thing about the fuel. The Olympus engines at full afterburner consumed fuel at a rate that made the Concorde's economics brutal, even by the standards of an already expensive aircraft to operate. At cruise, Mach 2, afterburners off, the Concorde burned through roughly 5,600 pounds of fuel per hour per engine. 4 engines. The entire transatlantic crossing consumed around 95 tons of fuel. That's enough to fill roughly 1,200 standard family car fuel tanks, used in 3.5 hours. The afterburners were only lit for the first few minutes of each flight. They didn't have to run long to matter. 27 years of twice-daily departures from Heathrow. The same sound, the same flame, the same shudder through the terminal glass. And many people who lived under that flight path, noise complaints and all, admitted they went outside to watch every time. The loudest thing in commercial aviation. And people missed it when it stopped. 9. The sonic boom that closed the world. When an aircraft breaks the sound barrier, it doesn't produce a single crack and move on. It generates a continuous pressure wave, a cone of compressed air that trails behind the aircraft for as long as it's flying supersonically, dragging across the ground below like an invisible furrow. Anyone standing in that path hears a double boom. The wave from the nose, then the wave from the tail, arriving a fraction of a second apart. At Mach 2, the Concorde's boom reached the ground at roughly 1 to 2 pounds of overpressure per square foot, enough to rattle windows in their frames, crack old plaster, and, in documented cases, startle livestock badly enough to affect their behavior for days. It wasn't a one-time event, it was continuous. The entire ground track beneath a supersonic flight path received the boom simultaneously, as the wave cone swept across the surface. The United States Federal Aviation Administration banned overland supersonic flight in 1973. The UK and France followed with their own restrictions. Several other countries imposed similar rules or simply refused overflight permissions for supersonic civil aircraft. The reasoning was straightforward. A transatlantic crossing might affect a few fishing vessels and some seabirds. A transcontinental crossing at Mach 2 would boom every city, town, and farm from one coast to the other twice a day, indefinitely. This single regulatory decision reshaped the Concorde's entire commercial existence. The aircraft had been designed as a global supersonic transport. The original vision, shared by both the British and French governments who jointly funded the program from 1962 onward, was a network of supersonic routes connecting major cities worldwide. New York to Los Angeles supersonically, London to Tokyo, Paris to Sydney. The Concorde was supposed to be the beginning of something, not the entirety of it. The overland ban eliminated most of those routes before the aircraft entered service. What remained were ocean crossings, the North Atlantic primarily, with some service to Bahrain, Caracas, and a handful of other destinations where the overwater routing was feasible. The fastest passenger aircraft ever built was confined to a narrow corridor of ocean between two continents. 70 airlines had placed options on the Concorde during the early 1970s, when the program looked like the future of long-haul aviation. After the boom ban, the oil crisis, and the revised economics of operating an aircraft that could only fly where it was legally permitted to go fast, every single one of those airlines canceled. All 70. Only Air France and British Airways flew it commercially, and only because their respective governments effectively transferred the aircraft to them at no cost. The boom ban didn't just limit where the Concorde could fly. It determined that there would only ever be 20 of them, that the program would never expand, and that supersonic passenger travel would remain a niche service on a single ocean route for its entire operational life. The fastest aircraft in commercial history. Grounded over land, only 20 were ever built. Number 8. 70 airlines placed options on the Concorde during the early 1970s. 70. Pan Am was on that list. TWA was on it. Japan Airlines, Lufthansa, Air India, Qantas, American Airlines, Continental. Carriers from across the world representing routes on every major long-haul corridor on the planet. The order book looked at that moment like the beginning of a supersonic age. Then the oil crisis hit in 1973. Jet fuel prices quadrupled almost overnight, and the economics of operating an aircraft that burned through fuel at the rate the Concorde did, roughly 4 times the consumption per seat of a 747 on the same route, shifted from challenging to catastrophic. The sonic boom ban closed the overland routes. The development costs shared between the British and French governments under a treaty signed in 1962 had already ballooned to a figure that made the program one of the most expensive peacetime engineering projects either country had ever undertaken. Every one of those 70 options was cancelled. All of them. What remained were 2 national airlines, British Airways and Air France, that flew the Concorde not because the commercial case was compelling, but because their governments had built the aircraft and needed someone to operate it. The planes were transferred to both carriers at effectively no cost. The development expenditure had already been written off by the taxpayers of 2 countries. The airlines were, in a meaningful sense, given the most advanced passenger aircraft in the world and asked to make something of it. 14 aircraft entered commercial service. 6 more were built as prototypes and development airframes, some of which never carried a paying passenger. The total production run, 20 aircraft across all variants, makes the Concorde one of the smallest production runs of any commercial jet in aviation history. The 747, by comparison, had over 1,500 airframes delivered across its production life. The 737 has exceeded 10,000, 20 Concordes, ever. In the history of the world, the manufacturing was split between the 2 countries under the terms of the original treaty. British Aircraft Corporation built the rear fuselage, tail, and engines on the British side. Aerospatiale handled the nose, cockpit, and forward fuselage on the French side. Components crossed the English Channel by ship and road to be assembled at final assembly lines in both Filton, near Bristol, and Toulouse. The last Concorde rolled off the line in 1979. The program closed, no further orders, no follow-on variant, No successor aircraft in development. The airlines that had canceled their options went on to fill their long-haul routes with 747s, flying more passengers more cheaply across the same oceans. The supersonic age that the Concorde was supposed to inaugurate simply didn't arrive. If you're enjoying the video, drop a like and a comment. It really does help the channel out. And we're not done, because the story of those 20 aircraft gets considerably darker before it ends. The analog cockpit. Number 7. Slide rules. That's what the engineers who designed the Concorde used to do the calculations. Not computers, slide rules, logarithm tables, and mechanical calculators. The program began in 1962, when digital computing existed in laboratories but not on engineering desks, and the mathematics required to design a sustained Mach 2 passenger aircraft, the aerodynamics, the thermodynamics, the structural load analysis, was worked out by hand by teams of engineers on both sides of the English Channel. The cockpit that resulted from this process was a wall of analog instrumentation. Dials, gauges, switches, circuit breakers, levers, hundreds of individual instruments covering every surface within reach of the three-person flight crew. Captain on the left, first officer on the right, and a flight engineer seated behind them facing a panel so dense with systems monitoring equipment that it looked less like an aircraft cockpit and more like the control room of a power station. No fly-by-wire, no digital flight management system, no glass cockpit displays. The Concorde entered commercial service in January 1976. It flew until October 2003. That's 27 years of service, during which time aviation technology moved from analog instruments to fully digital glass cockpits, from paper navigation charts to GPS, from flight engineers to 2 crew operations as standard. The 747 that entered service around the same time as the Concorde was substantially updated and modernized across multiple variants during those same decades. The Concorde was not. The analog systems were essentially frozen at the point of design. Modifying them would have required recertification of the entire aircraft, an enormously expensive process that the economics of operating just 14 airframes could never justify. So the cockpit that flew the last Concorde service in 2003 was recognizably the same cockpit that flew the first one in 1976. By its final years, the flight engineers who managed those systems were maintaining equipment that was, in some cases, older than they were. What this meant in practice was that flying the Concorde demanded a level of systems knowledge and manual skill that had largely disappeared from commercial aviation by the time the aircraft retired. Pilots described the aircraft as intensely demanding, not because it was badly designed, but because it required its crew to understand and manage everything directly without the automated systems that modern aircraft use to reduce workload. The Concorde didn't smooth things out for you. It told you what was happening and expected you to decide what to do about it. 3 crew members for a 100-seat aircraft. Slide rule mathematics keeping a Mach 2 airframe in the air. The most advanced passenger aircraft in the world, run on instruments that belonged to a previous era of aviation even while it was in service. There is a particular kind of engineering confidence in that, the certainty that the original design was good enough that it didn't need to be replaced, just maintained, and flown by people who knew exactly what they were doing. It was, and they did. 6. The speed record that still stands, 2 hours, 52 minutes, and 59 seconds. That is the fastest transatlantic crossing ever made by a commercial passenger aircraft, set by a British Airways Concorde on the 7th of February 1996, flying from New York's JFK to London Heathrow. The record has not been broken. No commercial aircraft operating today is capable of breaking it because no commercial aircraft operating today flies supersonically. The conditions that day were exceptional. A powerful North Atlantic jet stream, the band of fast-moving air that flows eastward at altitude across the ocean, was running at unusually high speeds, and the Concorde's flight crew positioned the aircraft to take maximum advantage of it. The jet stream added several hundred miles per hour to the aircraft's ground speed on top of its already supersonic airspeed. The result was a peak ground speed of approximately 1,350 miles per hour, about the speed of a rifle bullet, and faster than the Concorde typically managed on a standard crossing. To put 2 hours and 52 minutes in context, the standard Concorde crossing from New York to London ran at around 3 hours and 15 minutes to 3 hours and 30 minutes depending on winds. A subsonic 747 on the same route takes between 6.5 and 7 hours. The record flight was faster than the fastest regular Concorde service by over 20 minutes, and faster than a standard long-haul crossing by a factor of more than 2. The aircraft that set the record was a specific airframe, registration GBOAD, named City of Edinburgh, one of the 14 Concordes in British Airways fleet. It went on to complete hundreds more transatlantic crossings before the fleet's retirement in 2003. The record it set that February morning was never targeted again. It happened because the conditions aligned, the crew took the opportunity, and the aircraft did what it was built to do without restriction. What the record crossing also demonstrated was the Concorde's relationship with the jet stream, a relationship that the aircraft's operators understood and managed with considerable precision. Westbound crossings, flying against the jet stream, were slower and used more fuel. Eastbound crossings, flying with it, were faster and more efficient. On a strong jet stream day, the difference in crossing time between east and westbound could exceed 40 minutes. Flight planning for Concorde involved detailed analysis of jet stream position and strength before every departure. The record still sits in the books, uncontested, because the category of aircraft that could challenge it, supersonic commercial transports, currently has 0 active members. 2 hours, 52 minutes, 59 seconds. New York to London, breakfast in Manhattan, lunch in Mayfair, with time to spare before the afternoon. No other commercial aircraft has come within 2 hours of it, and the way things currently stand, none will. At number 5, the crash that changed everything. July 25th, 2000, written as the 25th of July 2000, began as a routine afternoon at Charles de Gaulle Airport outside Paris. Air France Flight 459. 0 was a charter service bound for New York, carrying 100 passengers, 9 crew members, and a full fuel load for the transatlantic crossing. The aircraft was Concorde F-BTSC, one of the 7 Air France airframes in commercial service. During the takeoff roll, the aircraft ran over a titanium wear strip that had fallen from a Continental Airlines DC-10 that departed minutes earlier. The strip punctured a tire. The tire disintegrated. A large fragment of rubber struck the underside of the left wing at high speed, sending a shockwave through the fuel tank above it. The tank didn't rupture from direct contact. The shockwave created a pressure pulse inside the tank that blew out a panel, releasing fuel in a stream that ignited on contact with the engine exhaust. The aircraft was already committed to takeoff. Too fast to stop, not fast enough to climb safely. The crew got the Concorde airborne, but with 2 of the 4 engines on the left side failing or on fire, the aircraft could not maintain altitude or control. It came down 2 minutes after leaving the runway, striking a hotel in the town of Gonesse. All 109 people on board died. 4 people on the ground were killed. It was the first and only fatal crash in the Concorde's commercial history. In 27 years and roughly 50,000 flight hours across both fleets, no Concorde had been lost with fatalities. The aircraft had accumulated one of the strongest safety records in commercial aviation. The crash of Flight 4590 ended that in 2 minutes and 23 seconds. The entire Concorde fleet, both British Airways and Air France, was grounded the following month, pending investigation and modification. Engineers redesigned the fuel tanks with Kevlar lining to resist puncture from tire debris. New tires were fitted. Electrical systems in the wheelbase were modified. The modifications took over a year to complete and certify. Concorde returned to service in November 2001. Passenger numbers never recovered. The combination of the crash, the modifications, and the broader collapse in transatlantic business travel following the September 2001 attacks in the United States left both airlines operating the aircraft at a loss they could no longer justify. British Airways and Air France announced the retirement of their fleets in April 2003. The last commercial Concorde flight landed at Heathrow on the 24th of October 2003, 3 years, 3 months, and 1 day after Ganes. The investigation concluded that the titanium strip, a component that cost almost nothing from an aircraft that had nothing to do with Concorde, had initiated the chain of events. A piece of metal about the size of a ruler, lying on a runway, 113 people, and the beginning of the end. 4. The retirement and the sky that went quiet. On the 24th of October 2003, 3 British Airways Concordes landed at Heathrow within minutes of each other. One had come from Edinburgh, one from Belfast, one from a final lap over the Bay of Biscay. They touched down in sequence, taxied to the terminal, and stopped. The engines were shut down. The passengers disembarked, and that was it. Air France had already retired their fleet 6 months earlier, in May 2003. British Airways held on through the summer, operating a handful of final farewell flights that sold out immediately at prices that reflected what people understood they were losing. The last revenue-generating Concorde service landed at 4:23 in the afternoon. The aircraft was towed to its stand. No other supersonic passenger aircraft was waiting to take its place. The retirement had been announced in April that year, jointly by British Airways and Air France, citing the economics, falling passenger numbers since the 2000 crash, rising maintenance costs on aging airframes, and the broader collapse in premium transatlantic travel following 2001. Airbus, which had by then absorbed the Concorde's manufacturer, declined to provide continued technical support beyond a certain point, which effectively set the clock. Without manufacturer support, operating a complex supersonic aircraft becomes untenable regardless of the will to continue. Residents near Heathrow had lived with the Concorde's departure sound for 27 years. Twice a day, the afterburners lit, the roar built, and the aircraft climbed away steeply over West London on its way to the Atlantic. Noise complaints had been filed consistently across that entire period. Formal objections, local council motions, letters to MPs. The sound was genuinely intrusive. Nobody pretended otherwise. And then many of those same residents, in interviews given after the retirement, said they missed it. Not the noise exactly, the specific noise. The knowledge that the sound meant something, that the thing making it was doing something no other aircraft could do, going somewhere faster than anyone else, carrying people who were about to have an experience unavailable anywhere else on Earth. The sky over Heathrow became quieter after October 2003. It was also, by most accounts, considerably duller. The retired airframes were distributed to museums. GBOAC went to the Manchester Airport Runway Visitor Park. GBOAD went to the Intrepid Sea Air and Space Museum in New York. FBVFA went to the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum Annex in Virginia. Others went to Barbados, Seattle, Brooklands, and the Fleet Air Arm Museum at Yeovilton. Each one towed carefully to its final position, engines cold, delta wings spread, going nowhere. 27 years of commercial service. Over 2.5 million passengers carried, roughly 50,000 flight hours across both fleets. The last scheduled supersonic passenger service in history ended on a Thursday afternoon in West London. The aircraft are still there, in their museums, exactly where they were left. 3. The cabin that felt like the future and looked like a hallway. Picture the interior of a standard economy cabin on a long-haul jet. The width, the overhead bins, the sense of lateral space even when it's full. Now take roughly half of that width away. What remains is approximately the interior dimension of the Concorde's passenger cabin, 8 feet across the fuselage with walls that curved inward, leaving a usable cabin width of about 7.5 feet. 2 seats on each side of a single central aisle, each row separated by a gap that gave the cabin the proportions of a narrow corridor in a well-appointed hotel. Tall passengers ducked aboard. The ceiling at the centerline was just over 6 feet, enough for most people, not enough for everyone. The overhead storage was minimal by modern standards. The windows, set deep into the fuselage walls, were smaller than a sheet of A4 paper. There were no lie-flat beds, no privacy screens, no suite configurations of the kind that define premium long-haul travel today, and passengers consistently described it as the finest flying experience of their lives, not despite the constraints. The constraints were almost beside the point because of what was happening outside those small windows and beneath the floor. The aircraft was at 60,000 feet. It was traveling at 1,350 miles per hour. The crossing was going to be over in 3 hours, which meant that the calculus of seat width and legroom, the arithmetic that dominates every other long-haul flight decision, simply didn't apply in the same way. You weren't going to be sitting there for 7 hours. You were going to be sitting there for 3, and then you were going to be in New York. British Airways fitted their Concorde cabins with seats that were narrower than standard business class by modern comparison, but upholstered and finished to a level that matched the ticket price. The galley was compact, but fully equipped. Meals were served on proper china with proper cutlery. Champagne was standard. The service was delivered by cabin crew who had been specifically selected and trained for Concorde operations, and who, given that the aircraft carried only 100 passengers on a route flown multiple times per week, frequently knew their regular passengers by name. The Air France configuration was similar in dimensions but different in catering philosophy. The French carrier leaned into the food and wine service as a differentiator, with menus developed in collaboration with notable chefs and wine lists that treated the crossing as an occasion rather than a transit. What both configurations shared was the understanding that the cabin was not the product. The speed was the product. The cabin was just where you sat while the product happened around you. The most remarkable passenger cabin in commercial aviation history was barely wide enough to pass someone in the aisle without turning sideways. No other commercial aircraft has ever made that feel like a detail not worth mentioning. 2. The hat, the bulkhead, and what the fuselage remembered. Earlier in this countdown, entry 14 covered thermal expansion. The fact that the Concorde's aluminium airframe grew by between 6 and 10 inches during a typical Mach 2 crossing, the entire fuselage stretching as the skin temperature climbed past 100 degrees Celsius. The number was given. The translation was made. Almost a foot, nose to tail, every flight. But the hat story deserves its own entry, because it's the detail that makes the engineering concrete in a way that specifications can't. During cruise, a flight engineer placed his uniform cap on a ledge in the cockpit, specifically into a gap between a panel and the adjacent bulkhead. A natural enough thing to do. The gap existed at ground temperature when the fuselage was at its resting dimensions, and it was wide enough to slot the cap into comfortably. At Mach 2, the fuselage had expanded. The gap was wider. The cap sat there unremarkable while the aircraft crossed the Atlantic at 60,000 feet and 1,350 miles per hour. Then the Concorde began its descent. Speed reduced, the skin temperature dropped, the aluminium contracted, slowly, steadily, the entire airframe returning toward its ground dimensions as the heat of supersonic cruise bled away. The gap between the panel and the bulkhead narrowed, and then it closed. Around the cap. The fuselage, returning to the shape it had been in before takeoff, simply incorporated the cap into itself, permanently pinched, sealed between two components that were now flush against each other as they had been on the ground before the flight began. The hat was not retrievable without disassembly of the panel. It stayed. What makes this specific and not apocryphal is that it illustrates, with complete clarity, what thermal expansion actually means in a structure you work inside. The Concorde's engineers designed for expansion. They accounted for it in the gaps between trim panels, in the routing of cables and pipes, in the tolerances of every fitting that had to mate correctly at both ground temperature and cruise temperature. The aircraft was, in a meaningful sense, two slightly different objects depending on whether it was on the ground or in the air. The flight engineer's cap found the one gap that the designers hadn't specifically protected against casual use, which is, honestly, a reasonable oversight. You don't typically need to specify do not store personal items in thermal expansion gaps in an aircraft maintenance manual. But yeah, after that, presumably, you do. The Concorde flew 27 years of transatlantic crossings, thousands of expansion and contraction cycles. The airframe stretched and shrank, stretched and shrank. The aluminium doing what aluminium does when you heat it to over 100 degrees and then let it cool. Flight after flight, decade after decade. Somewhere in the cockpit of at least one of those aircraft, sealed between a panel and a bulkhead, a uniform cap went along for all of it, permanently pinching between the panel and the bulkhead. Why nothing replaced it? Supersonic passenger travel has been promised continuously since October 2003. Not vaguely promised, specifically promised with company names, investment figures, prototype aircraft, and projected entry into service dates attached. Boom, Supersonic, based in Denver, has been developing its Overture aircraft since around 2014, targeting speeds of Mach 1.7 and routes across the North Atlantic. Ariane Supersonic raised over $1 billion in funding before dissolving in 2021 without completing a prototype. Spike Aerospace has been developing its S5-12 concept for over a decade. NASA's X-59 experimental aircraft, designed to test quiet supersonic flight over land, completed its first flight in 2024 but carries no passengers and exists purely as a research platform. None of these programs have put a paying passenger supersonically across the Atlantic. Not one. The physics haven't changed. Sonic booms still propagate from any aircraft flying supersonically at altitude. The pressure wave is a consequence of the speed, not the design, and no currently certified technology eliminates it over populated land. Jet fuel still burns at the rate it burns. Aluminium still expands at cruise temperatures. The regulatory environment that confined the Concorde to ocean routes in 1973 remains substantially in place, though NASA's quiet supersonic research is aimed at eventually changing the overland rules if the boom can be shaped into something less disruptive. What has changed is the cost of developing a new supersonic transport from scratch. The Concorde was funded by two national governments under a treaty obligation, with the development expenditure effectively socialized across the British and French taxpaying public over a period of more than a decade. No government is currently funding a supersonic passenger program at that scale. The companies pursuing it are doing so on private capital, which means they need a viable commercial return, which means the economics have to work without a government backstop. So far, they don't. Not at a ticket price that enough people will pay, on enough routes that are legally flyable, with enough passengers per aircraft to cover operating costs. The Concorde solved this problem by having the development costs already written off before it entered service, operating on routes where the sonic boom rules didn't apply, and serving a clientele for whom the ticket price was genuinely not the primary consideration. That specific combination of conditions, government-funded development, ocean-only routes, ultra-premium pricing, existed once, in a particular political and economic moment in the 1960s and 70s, and it has not recurred. The aircraft that resulted from those conditions sits in museums, now, in London, in New York, in Washington, in Seattle. Delta wings spread, engines cold, the droop nose locked in its ground position, each one towed to its final location and left there, exactly as it was on the last day it flew. A machine from the future stranded in the past, waiting for a successor that has been promised for 2 decades and hasn't arrived yet. If you thought these facts were extraordinary, wait until you see our video on the SR-71 Blackbird, the aircraft that flew even faster and never carried a single passenger. Click here and I'll see you over there.